Sarah had been living in the apartment for almost 2 months. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Affordable, close to her new job, and tucked in a quiet part of the city. The small 2-bedroom apartment, located on the 3rd floor of an old building, had a cozy charm about it. The wood floors creaked and the vintage wallpaper peeled at the edges, but it had a certain warmth that made Sarah feel safe after the busy days spent at her new job. The place felt lived in, as though it had a history, one that, for the time being, she was content to ignore. At first, everything was fine. She settled in quickly, making the apartment her own. The living room was filled with plants, and she hung up a few pieces of art on the walls to give it personality. The small kitchen, though outdated, felt comfortable. The bathroom had an old clawfoot tub that Sarah had fallen in love with the first time she saw it. Everything was perfect, until the first night. The whispers began the first night she stayed in the apartment. She had just returned from work, exhausted from a long day, and went straight to bed, collapsing into the softness of the mattress. It wasn't long before she started hearing a faint sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling the windows or the old pipes groaning in the walls. But the longer she listened, the more distinct the sound became. It was a whisper, soft and barely audible, like a voice calling out in the distance. Sarah. She froze. It was so faint she almost convinced herself it was just her imagination, some afterthought of a busy day. She pulled the covers tighter around her and tried to ignore it. But then the whisper came again, more clearly this time. Sarah, help me. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide. She glanced around the room, but there was no one there. She listened carefully, but the apartment was silent now. No voices, no sounds of footsteps in the hallway, just the creaking of the old wood. It must be the pipes, she thought, or maybe the building settling. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to relax, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few days were normal, at least on the surface. She went to work, returned home, and went to bed. But every night, the whispers continued. They were faint, like a soft murmur that traveled through the walls. Sometimes she thought she heard her name, sometimes it was just a low, unintelligible murmur. But each time, the whispers came from somewhere inside the walls. One evening, she decided to investigate. She stood in the middle of her living room, listening intently. The whispers were louder now, more persistent. They seemed to come from the far corner of the apartment, near the bedroom wall. She walked over to the wall and pressed her ear to it, heart pounding in her chest. The whispering grew clearer. Please, help me. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded like it was coming from the other side, as if someone was trapped there trying to communicate with her. Who is it? She whispered, half expecting the voice to respond. But there was only silence. The tapping began then, a faint rapping against the wall, like fingernails scraping against the drywall. She quickly pulled away from the wall, her skin prickling with dread. The next day, Sarah went down to the landlord's office to ask about the strange sounds. The building was old, she knew that, but this seemed different. This felt wrong. Hey, Mr. Harris, she began, trying to sound casual. I've been hearing some weird noises in my apartment at night, whispers and tapping from the walls. Do you know anything about it? Mr. Harris, a thin man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, looked at her over the desk. He gave a nervous chuckle. It's just an old building, Sarah. Old buildings settle. Pipes, walls, floors, they all make noises. It's nothing to be concerned about. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She pressed further. I don't know. It sounds like voices sometimes. It's not just the pipes. Mr. Harris's expression shifted. His eyes briefly darkened before he cleared his throat and stood up. Well, he said slowly, the building's been here for decades. Some of the tenants have, well, Let's just say there have been a lot of changes over the years. Nothing I can tell you about, though. It's just a noisy building. Okay, Sarah said, still unsure. She left his office with a sense of unease gnawing at her stomach. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing it, the whispers, the tapping, and then the faint sound of something scratching against the walls. Sarah finally decided to investigate on her own. She grabbed a flashlight and a hammer, hoping that maybe she could just knock on the walls and pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was ridiculous, but she needed to know. She went to the corner of the room where the noise had been the loudest. Her hand trembled as she lightly tapped the wall with the hammer. Tap, tap, tap. She waited, listening for any response. There it was again. A whisper. Please, let me out. The words were more distinct now, but they didn't sound like they were coming from the walls. They were coming from inside them. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped back. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, ghostly shadows across the room. Her gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, and she saw something that froze her blood. A thin crack in the wall, barely visible at first, but now it seemed to grow larger, as though something was pushing from within. A cold gust of air rushed out of the crack, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Sarah could see her breath in front of her as the darkness deepened. The whispers intensified, now more frantic, pleading. "Help me, please, I'm so cold." Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the crack. She hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow, but curiosity and terror got the better of her. With one swift motion, she swung the hammer at the crack in the wall. It was as though the wall had been waiting for her to make the first move. The wall gave way with a sharp, bone-crushing crack. The drywall crumbled, revealing a small, hidden room behind it. It was dark, the air thick with dust, but as Sarah shone the flashlight inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A woman, or what was left of her. The figure was curled up in the corner, her hands raised as if in an eternal plea for help. Her skin was gray and mottled, her face twisted in a silent scream. She wore tattered clothes that looked ancient, and her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at Sarah, though there was no life behind them. Sarah stepped back, gasping for air. The whispers stopped. The room was eerily silent, save for the sound of Sarah's rapid breathing. She tried to gather herself, but her mind raced. Her heart pounded. The woman in the wall, she had been trapped there. For how long? Days? Years? Decades? She had been sealed away, a prisoner, forgotten by everyone. Suddenly the room grew darker. The shadows seemed to move, shifting like living things. Sarah turned to run, but as she did, the whispers began again. Louder now, desperate, angry. "You shouldn't have freed me. Now it's too late." The temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror, as a cold wind began to swirl around her. The woman's figure began to rise slowly, her twisted form now standing, her mouth opening to release a scream that was nothing but a hollow, empty echo. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to close in on Sarah. She turned to run, but she could hear the soft whispers in the walls, in the ceiling, in the floors, following her every step. "We're all in here," the voices chanted, growing louder. "We're waiting for you." She ran out of the room, down the hallway, through the apartment. But no matter how fast she moved, the whispers followed her, haunting her every step. She burst out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her, but the whispers continued, lingering in her mind, in the walls, in the darkness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sarah left the apartment that night. She never returned. The apartment sat empty for years, the walls now silent. But to this day, the people who live in that building still hear the whispers sometimes, faint at first, but growing louder when the clock strikes midnight. And some say, if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice, the woman who was never meant to be freed, whispering from the walls, forever asking for help.